On a chilly night in Buenos Aires, a team of Mossad agents hid in the shadows, waiting and watching for a man whose identity was a lie. Ricardo Clement was a seemingly average family man leading an unassuming life. But he was no ordinary man. He was one of the architects of the Nazis' final solution, the plan to annihilate every single Jew in Europe. His real name was Adolf Eichmann, and his hands dripped with Jewish blood. For years he had evaded justice. He had vanished, gone without a trace. But Eichmann couldn't stay hidden forever. And one day in 1960, a group of Israeli Avengers finally brought him to justice. So, how did the Mossad manage to catch one of the most notorious Nazis in the world? Six long years of bloodshed in Europe came to an end in the spring of 1945, when the Allies and Soviets finally toppled Germany's Third Reich. As the Allied armies liberated Europe from the grip of the Nazis, they learned the full extent of the horrors. 6 million Jews and 5 million more enemies of the Reich had been murdered. The evidence of the atrocities was overwhelming. The Jewish world was hungry for justice. 4 months after liberation, top Nazis stood trial in Nuremberg, Germany, as prosecutors meticulously detailed their sickening and inhumane actions. A year and a half after Auschwitz was first liberated, the Nuremberg trials concluded. Some of the worst Nazi leaders swung from the gallows. Others took their own lives before they could be held accountable. Many more got away with sentences that were too light, given the scope of their crimes. But a few high-ranking Nazis evaded justice altogether by fleeing. One of those fugitives was Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann joined the Nazis' intelligence service after rising through the ranks of the Austrian Nazi Party. In Berlin, he was assigned to handle the Jewish question. In other words, how to address the status of Germany's Jews. As Germany expanded its territory, Eichmann advised the Nazis on the so-called evacuation of Jews and Poles in areas of the Greater Reich. His superiors realized he had two obsessions. He hated Jews, and he loved logistics. Logistics like how to systematically strip Jews of their rights, round them up, and force them onto trains under the pretense of resettlement. As the Nazis took over Europe, Eichmann organized more and more deportations of Jews from those occupied lands. In 1942, Eichmann gathered with other top-ranking Nazis to discuss a final solution to the Jewish question, the plan for the mass murder of every single Jew in Europe and beyond. Under Eichmann's direction, millions of Jews were packed into squalid ghettos, banished to the concentration camps, and suffocated in the gas chambers. Day after day, cattle cars crammed with Jews rattled across the fields of Europe, carrying men, women, and children to be slaughtered, to be systematically starved, beaten, and forced into harsh labor. After the war, Eichmann was arrested by the Americans and put in a prisoner of war camp, but they didn't know who he actually was. He told them his name was Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was afraid that the Allies would eventually discover his true identity. So one night in 1946, under cover of darkness, Eichmann escaped. He managed to hide until 1950. By this time, most of the world had given up on chasing Nazis. So with the help of the Catholic Church and a secret German network known as the Rat Line, he slipped covertly across Europe. His ultimate destination? Argentina. Post-war Argentina was a haven for Nazi war criminals. The Argentinian Minister of War admired fascists and was eager to give them a new home across the ocean. In July 1950, Eichmann boarded a ship leaving Italy for Argentina using a new false name. 2 years later, his wife and 3 sons joined him in Buenos Aires. Eichmann might have lived out the rest of his life as Ricardo Clement, a low-level Mercedes-Benz employee, if not for a blind man in Buenos Aires. Lothar Hermann was born in Germany to a Jewish father and a Christian mother. He was nearly blind. This was a result of the beatings he'd endured as a political prisoner at the Dachau concentration camp in the 1930s. But his other senses were acute. And when his daughter's friend boasted about his father's war record as a Nazi officer, Lothar Hermann's antenna went up. This friend introduced himself as Nick Eichmann. He had no idea that his host was remembering every word. Months later, the Hermanns moved away. But Lothar Hermann hadn't forgotten what he'd learned at his dinner table. So when his daughter Sylvia read him an article that mentioned Adolf Eichmann, something clicked in his brain. Nick Eichmann's father was Adolf Eichmann. They weren't sure if Nick's father was even alive. Nick had told Sylvia that his mother remarried after the war. Whom would the Hermanns turn to for help? The German embassy in Buenos Aires was crawling with Nazi sympathizers. If Hermann alerted them, he suspected they would help Eichmann disappear again. Instead, he wrote to judicial authorities in Germany who were still eager to prosecute Nazi war criminals, alerting them to Eichmann's presence in Argentina. His letter ended up in the hands of Fritz Bauer, a Jewish prosecutor general in West Germany. Bauer wrote back, enclosing a blurry photo of Eichmann. Was this Nick's father? There was only one way to find out. Sylvia Hermann trekked to the dusty street in Buenos Aires where Nick lived with his family. She was soon joined at their kitchen table by a mild-mannered man in glasses. He introduced himself as her friend Nick's uncle. He seemed pleasant enough. Sylvia wasn't sure if he was really Eichmann, but when Nick said goodbye to Sylvia, he called this man father. Father, not uncle. It was Eichmann. Back in Germany, Bauer knew his colleagues in government couldn't be trusted. Some of them had actually been Nazis, and they might help Eichmann vanish again. So in September 1957, Bauer turned to the people he believed would pursue this lead, the Israelis. In early 1958, the Mossad sent an agent to Argentina, but after 2 weeks of surveilling the house on Chacabuco Street, the agent didn't spot anyone with Eichmann's description, and he didn't think it was possible for an important Nazi to be living in such a shabby little house. He cabled a negative report back to Israel. Bauer was frustrated. 2 weeks wasn't long enough to investigate, so he introduced the Israelis to Lothar Hermann, whose identity Bauer had kept secret until then. When the Israelis realized that Lothar Hermann was blind, they were skeptical. But they wired him some money so he could keep investigating. He and Sylvia tracked down the records for the house at 4261 Chacabuco Street. They discovered 2 names listed on the electricity meters, Dagoto and Clement, but these names meant nothing to the Israelis. The hunt for Eichmann was at a standstill. But in late 1959, Fritz Bauer came to the Israelis with an update that changed everything. Bauer had received information from a source who confirmed that Eichmann was in Argentina. And the source had real, solid details. Details like how Eichmann had escaped Germany, the jobs he'd held, and that he was living under the alias of Ricardo Clement. The source was a German who had briefly worked with Eichmann in Buenos Aires. He hated the Nazi agenda, and he was horrified that Eichmann was still walking free. Bauer reportedly threatened to pursue Eichmann's extradition to Germany, but Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion wanted Eichmann brought to Israel, alive. He wanted Eichmann to be confronted with the mountains of evidence of his mass extermination of the Jews. And the right place for this trial wasn't Germany, it was the state of Israel. The trial would be an expression of Israel's sovereignty in its role on the world stage representing the Jewish people. It was where the Jews who had emerged emaciated from the camps had rebuilt themselves. But Argentina would refuse any request for extradition. The only way to get Eichmann out was if the Israelis did it themselves. So the Mossad once again swung into action. On March 1st, an Israeli agent called Tzvi Aharoni stepped off a plane in Buenos Aires. His mission? Obtain irrefutable proof that Ricardo Clement was Eichmann. Aharoni arrived with a folder bulging with information on Eichmann, every detail that the Israelis could find about him, his wife, and his children. His first step was to scope out 4261 Chacabuco Street, the house Sylvia Hermann had visited a few years prior. But Aharoni was in for an unpleasant surprise. The family living there had moved out, so Aharoni recruited some helpers, local Argentinians called Juan and Lorenzo. Juan discovered that Dietl, one of the Eichmann sons, worked at a nearby garage. He went to get a good look at him and to try and get his new address. Dietl wouldn't tell Juan where he lived, but he matched the description of Eichmann's son, Dietl. Meanwhile, Lorenzo had been posing as an insurance salesman to find out who exactly had lived at 4261 Chacabuco Street. He confirmed to Aharoni that Ricardo Clement had lived at the house. Aharoni wired a coded message back to the Mossad's headquarters. Clement was very likely Eichmann, but every attempt to tail Dietl and find out his address was a bust. Aharoni was getting desperate. He sent Juan back to see Dietl. Showing too much interest in the family was risky, but luckily for Aharoni, it paid off. Juan came back with a description of how to get to the Clements' new house on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. And even better, with confirmation from Dietl that his family's last name wasn't Clement, it was Eichmann. Days later, parked near Eichmann's house, Aharoni spotted a middle-aged man at the home. He knew that he was looking at Eichmann. He sent a report in invisible ink back to Israel. There was no longer any doubt that Ricardo Clement was Adolf Eichmann. Back in Israel, Mossad director Issa Harel assembled a crack squad of Avengers to capture Eichmann and bring him back to Israel. Legal advisors had told the Mossad that ideally, Eichmann would return of his own free will. That way, he couldn't claim that he'd been coerced into confessing his identity or into standing trial. The trial would be absolutely legitimate. Harel himself would be on the ground in Argentina. Rafi Eitan would lead the team. Each of the 11 agents chosen possessed unique skills. One could pick any lock. One was a master forger. Another was a doctor who would ensure Eichmann stayed alive on the journey to Israel. Yet another was a fluent Spanish speaker, useful for running interference if anyone sniffed out the Israelis as foreign agents. And some were survivors. And every last one of them wanted justice. The mission was extraordinarily complex. First, they had to capture Eichmann without anyone noticing. Next, they'd have to bring him somewhere no one would find. Then, get him to admit who he was. And then, get him to agree to go to Israel. And finally, get him out of Argentina. And all before Eichmann's family and the Argentinian police got suspicious. If they managed this, it would be the achievement of a century. In late April, the agents began trickling one by one into Argentina. They took roundabout routes, crisscrossing Europe on connecting flights and traveling on false passports. On the ground, they split up. Some hunted for safe houses, others secured cars, and others were in charge of figuring out how and when to capture Eichmann. For days, they observed his house on Garibaldi Street. Eichmann was a creature of habit. He returned home from work every day on the bus, disembarking precisely at 7:40 p.m. The team realized that their best chance of success was to intercept Eichmann on the short walk from the bus stop to his house. Meanwhile, Issa Harel was still working out the details of how to extract Eichmann from Argentina. A sea journey would take too long. The only safe option was by air. But Israel's official airline didn't fly to South America, and Harel was afraid that a new El Al flight so close to Eichmann's disappearance would arouse suspicion. But luck was on his side. Harel learned that an Israeli diplomatic delegation had been invited to Argentina's independence celebration in late May. This was the perfect cover. The first El Al flight to Argentina would depart Tel Aviv in May and return a couple days later with the diplomatic delegation, and, if all went well, with an extra passenger. The 0 hour for Eichmann's capture was May 11th, almost 15 years to the day that the Nazis had surrendered. At 7:35 p.m. on May 11th, the capture squad moved into place. They had given themselves only minutes to lie in wait for Eichmann. Finally, headlights pierced the darkness. Bus 203 was coming. The agents waited. But the bus never stopped. Eichmann wasn't there. Rafi Eitan made a snap decision. They would wait. At 8:05 p.m., another bus 203 rumbled onto the road. A man stepped off and turned into the direction of Garibaldi Street. When the man with glasses rounded the corner on Garibaldi Street, Malkin called out to him.
Un momentito, señor.
3 words that changed world history. Seconds later, Eichmann was in the hands of the Mossad, a fugitive, no more. On the drive to the safe house, Tzvi Aharoni warned him to be silent. No response. He asked what language Eichmann understood. No response. For a few minutes, they thought Eichmann had lost consciousness, and then they heard a voice speaking flawless German.
Ich habe mich schon in mein Schicksal ergeben, which translates, I'm already resigned to my fate.
The first part of the team's mission was complete. That evening at the safe house, Aharoni was elated when Eichmann confessed his real identity.
My name is Adolf Eichmann.
At some point, while he was in the safe house, Eichmann agreed of his own free will to go to Israel. For days, the team waited tensely, keeping Eichmann under 24-hour guard. In the meantime, Issa Harel was still hammering out the details of how to get Eichmann onto the El Al flight. Should they smuggle him onto the plane in a diplomatic cargo crate? Hide him in a catering cart? Or walk him onto the plane right under the watchful eyes of the Argentinian airport police? Each course of action was risky, but the third option turned out to be their best choice. Hours before the flight to Israel was scheduled to depart, the agents gave Eichmann a new look. They dyed his hair, glued on a false mustache, and aged him with makeup. And to complete the disguise, they dressed him in an El Al uniform, including a cap with the Star of David. The irony of this moment wasn't lost on anyone. 15 years earlier, Eichmann's cap boasted the skull and crossbones of the SS. Now, he wore a Jewish symbol and carried a passport with the last name, Zichroni, my memory. After years of living under a fake name, Eichmann's final identity in Argentina was that of a Jew. The Mossad agents prepared to accompany Eichmann back to Israel. Some would wear the uniform of El Al crew members. Others would fly as regular passengers, and a few would stay on the ground to get rid of any evidence. They would depart Buenos Aires later. The team had to ensure that Eichmann wouldn't attempt a last-minute escape. The doctor and the squad carefully administered a sedative to keep Eichmann drowsy. At the airport, the real El Al crew members clustered around Eichmann. Together with the disguised Mossad agents, they bumped Eichmann up the stairs to the plane and buckled him into a seat. Eichmann didn't make a sound. On May 22nd, the plane carrying Eichmann landed on Israeli soil. The next day, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion dropped a bombshell.
לפני זמן מה נתגלה על ידי שירותי המודיעין בישראל אחד מגדולי פושעי הנאצים, Adolf Eichmann.
Adolf Eichmann was in Jewish hands. 1 year later, Eichmann stood trial. After legal preliminaries, Israel's Attorney General delivered his opening statement just days after Jews around the world had sat at the Passover Seder table, retelling the ancient story of Jewish liberation. And now they were holding another enemy to account.
I do not stand alone. Here with me at this moment stand 6 million prosecutors. But alas, they cannot rise to level the finger of accusation in the direction of the glass dot and cry out, J'accuse. Their blood cries to heaven, but their voice cannot be heard.
Throughout the hours and hours of legal proceedings, Eichmann pretended that he was just a cog in the wheel, a bureaucratic functionary who was in charge of train timetables. He insisted no evidence existed showing he had been anything more than that, except that evidence did exist. A Dutch journalist and former member of the Waffen-SS living in Argentina had recorded Eichmann telling his story. For hours, they sat together while Eichmann went on and on and on.
10,3 Millionen Juden getötet, dann wäre ich befriedigt, würde sagen, gut, wir haben einen Feind vernichtet.
The Israeli prosecutors didn't have the tapes themselves, but they had the transcripts. But Eichmann argued that the transcripts distorted his words. Either way, the Israeli Supreme Court didn't accept them as evidence. But even without the recordings, Israeli prosecutors had reams and reams of evidence. Over 1,600 documents detailing the persecution of Europe's Jews. And Eichmann's signature was on many of the documents. The documents weren't the only evidence introduced. 110 witnesses were called to the stand, testifying about the horrors they saw and experienced. For many survivors, their testimony was the first time they had ever talked about their history. Now they had the attention of millions of people who had never before heard survivors speak. Many were deeply anguished at revisiting the hell of the Holocaust. Still, they persevered, and the world was compelled to listen, to face the barbarity they had suffered. The trial complicated the polarized attitudes among Israelis about armed resistance, passivity, and collaboration. The idea that some Jews had gone like sheep to the slaughter, when in reality, they had been trapped in a system designed to slowly crush them into oblivion. Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, war crimes, and membership in a criminal organization. Within a year, he was hanged. Eichmann's capture and trial showed the world that the Jewish state would go to any lengths to deliver justice for its people. Like a phoenix, the Jews had risen from the ashes, and now they would control their own destiny. For survivors, the trial unlocked memories shut away for 15 years. Their testimony forced a collective reckoning. What it meant for the Jews when the world was silent in the face of devastating injustice. Now the survivors spoke for themselves and for the 6 million, telling the world to never forget.